I wonder who was up at 4 a.m. watching the Australian Open this morning. I certainly wasn't. We'll talk to Liam Flanagan about that shortly. Now, debate continues over that Indigenous voice to Parliament. Now, surprise, surprise, the Teal Independents, they've confirmed today, or most of them, that they will support the Prime Minister if he moves to legislate the voice regardless of the results of a referendum. Now, that sort of says to me that they're prepared, the government, and the Teals certainly have said they are, to ignore the will of the Australian people. Shadow Communications Minister Sarah Henderson joins me from Geelong. Great to catch up again. No surprise on the Teals, I wouldn't have thought, from you.
Well, Steve, good afternoon. Great to join you, and no surprise. It reminds me a bit of when Bill Shorten said about Julia Gillard. I agree with what she said. I don't know what she said, but I agree with it anyway. The bottom line is, Steve, that the Prime Minister has not been able to describe the details of the voice. He's not been able to tell Australians what it actually means, how it will operate. And I think he's rapidly driving the voice off the tracks. This is an absolute shambles. And of course, we've seen that shocking train wreck interview on 2GB this week by the Prime Minister. And then, of course, the doctored transcript where clearly they wanted to hide the fact that they hadn't sought the advice of the Solicitor General, which is absolutely extraordinary. So this process is running off the rails, and clearly the Prime Minister is treating Australians like mugs.
So, Sarah, when will the opposition form their viewpoint and announce it? Will you say that the opposition is going to say no? Will that time come?
Well, Peter Dutton wrote to the Prime Minister on the 7th of January, setting out a whole range of questions. And while the Prime Minister criticised receiving the letter, he hasn't even had the courtesy to answer those questions, really important questions like how will the members of the voice be selected? What will happen if there's some extraordinary circumstances and the committee has to be dissolved? A whole range of important questions that this government has not been able to address. So frankly, until such time that these questions can be answered, and it appears that the government has no intention of answering these questions, then why should the opposition trust the government? Why should Australians trust the government? This is like Dennis Danutu in the castle talking about the vibe of the Constitution. This is an absolute insult to Australians. I have never seen a more botched process in terms of any proposal for constitutional change. And as I say, I think Anthony Albanese is running this process off the rails.
Well, even Indigenous Australians are split. We're going to have the spectre on Thursday, Australia Day, where you're going to have protests through the streets of major capital cities saying, Indigenous lobbyists saying, don't vote yes for the voice.
Well, I'm not surprised because we don't know what it means. We don't know what it will lead to. We don't know the powers of this voice committee. We don't know what the High Court may say or may not say about the sort of the scope of the powers. And frankly, why should any Australian want to get on board the voice when they don't know what it means? It is absolute joke, Steve. I mean,
it's just so confusing for everybody. Confusing for everyone. Absolutely. Yeah. In your role as communications spokesman, I note today that the former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, who might end up being the most disastrous appointment Anthony Albanese ever makes, he's the new ambassador to the United States, he's going to stand down as chairman of his media lobby group, which is called Australians for a Murdoch Royal Commission, when he formally becomes the ambassador. He had no choice, I presume. I didn't even really know that such a thing existed. Is that the right thing for him to do?
Well, that's very decent of him, of course, to put the national interest ahead of his own pet projects. Clearly, the former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, in his new position as the ambassador for Australia in the United States, has absolutely no choice but to do the right thing by the Australian government and the Australian people. He's led a unjustified jihad against Rupert Murdoch. It's been frankly disgraceful, in my view, without foundation, and I'm pleased that he has seen common sense prevail.
In your local area, Geelong, there is a brewing issue there. Now, the Deputy Prime Minister, Richard Marles, you want him to intervene and stop what is the proposed closure of Epworth, Geelong's maternity ward. Why would they be closing a maternity ward? We're going through this great debate in Queensland about how there's not enough maternity ward assets in that state. Why are they closing that in Geelong?
Steve, we really don't know, other than I think this is being driven by profit. But certainly what is absolutely disgraceful, in the fastest growing region in the country, we have not seen either the state or federal Labor government step up, including the Deputy Prime Minister, the member for Corio, based here in Geelong, Richard Marles, who's run around for the last 10 years getting photo opportunities with Joel Selwood, the former captain of the mighty Geelong Cats. And yet when the Selwoods reach out for help saying we are distressed, this is dangerous, we cannot afford to lose an entire maternity service in Geelong, of course, Labor MPs, Richard Marles, Libby Coker, and of course the Prime Minister, they all go missing in action. It's an absolute disgrace. There was some very big challenges with workforce. They have largely been resolved because of the magnificent doctors and midwives and nurses, all of whom have stood up and fought for this maternity service. So to the Labor Party, to Epworth, I say this absolutely cannot happen. It's a disgrace. And I say shame on Libby Coker, shame on Richard Marles, for not doing anything to stand up for women and families in our region.
Yeah, more strength to you. Thank you very much for joining us. That's Shadow Communications Minister Sarah Henderson.
Thanks, Steve.